Hello fellow kin, welcome back to the channel and welcome to another unit analysis video. In today's episode we're going to be taking a look at everyone's favorite marauding barbarians, the Cthonian Berserks. First thing on the agenda today is answering the question as to who are they? How are they toughness 5 and shirtless? We'll then take a look at how to best equip them, how to best use them, some stratagems and combos, and some important considerations to keep in mind when you decide to run this unit. So who are they? Well, in the lore, these guys represent elite subterranean miners that pride themselves on boasting their internal and external cybernetic augmentations to their fellow kin, which is why they walk around shirtless and effectively have no save, but they're still toughness 5. What this actually translates to on the table is a really glass cannon melee unit that really wants to get into melee combat, punch above its weight, before succumbing to basically any incoming damage. Because of that, their primary role in this army is to be a really powerful trading piece. They have a very surprisingly flexible loadout between weapon options that you have available, and they also can tech into some crowd control through the use of their mole grenade launcher, which we'll take a look at in just a moment. So how do we run these guys? Well, on the screen here I put a picture of the data card for this unit, and we could see their basic stat line is movement 5, toughness 5, a pitiful 6+ save, 2 wounds, 7 leadership, and OC 1. What's interesting is they have an innate 5+ feel no pain, which does help, especially since they're 2 wounds apiece, and on a 4+, when a model in this unit dies, you can fight back. So a conditional fight on death, but a fight on death nonetheless. It's worth mentioning that these guys had a very interesting start to the edition where they were basically considered to be one of the worst units in the index. However, as time went on, people managed to find a use for this unit in their lists, as it proved to be a really reliable and effective trading piece, especially at 100 points. And what this ultimately comes down to is their flexible loadout. They're very cheap, and in terms of warrior options, you have several choices you can make in list design. You can opt for mauls or axes. You can opt for optional gauntlets on one of the models. You can also include a free grenade launcher on one of the models, which keeps their melee weapon, but allows you to have some really interesting play with the ability of subterranean explosives. And what this ability does is that if the weapon hits, you roll a 4+, and then after that, the person has -2 to their movement, -2 to their advance, and -2 to their charge roll. So it's honestly pretty powerful if it does go off, making for a very powerful ability, but one that's somewhat unreliable. All that said, we have a very interesting unit profile on our hands here, especially at the cost of just 100 points. You may notice that, other than the mole launcher, which is really just here to tech into that crowd control rather than actually do any damage, they only have melee capabilities. There's no ranged option for this unit, again, other than their mole launcher, which is on one model. So the question now becomes, well, what is the best way for me to equip these guys in terms of their melee weapons? And we have several choices that I mentioned. So the first one up is the Concussion Maul. The Concussion Maul is 3 attacks on weapon skill 4, strength 9, -2 AP, and 3 damage. We also have the option of taking a Heavy Plasma Axe, and the Heavy Plasma Axe comes with 2 modes. It has Strike and Sweep, so already just some nice innate flexibility within this choice itself. And so for both profiles, starting with Strike, we have 3 attacks at weapon skill 3, strength 6, -2, 2 damage. Conversely, when we look at the Sweep profile, we have 6 attacks up from 3, weapon skill 3, strength 4, -1, 1 damage. The last option is the ability to equip one single model within the unit with twin concussion gauntlets. And so to clarify this, you'll be taking a squad of 5 with either concussion mauls or a squad of 5 with the Heavy Plasma Axe. Among that squad of 5, you'll be able to equip one model with the option of having twin concussion gauntlets and another model with the additional inclusion of the mole grenade launcher, which is free. So there's no real net loss with that. However, when we look at the melee profiles, there is the potential trade-off between losing one concussion maul or losing one plasma axe for the twin concussion gauntlets. And this profile is twin linked. It's 4 attacks, weapon skill 4, strength 9, -1, 2 damage. So looking at these profiles altogether, just very surface level, it seems like the question is, do I want anti-elite or do I plan on fighting more lower toughness, medium toughness units that I want to clear out with the axes? But maybe there is one clear choice that stands out above the others. Additionally, is it worth including one model with the gauntlets, or are we better off just keeping everything uniform? Let's do some math and figure it out. The first profile we're going to look at are the axes in strike mode. So I highlighted strike in red. This is going to be the color for this weapon profile when we start looking at the numbers. And so I put on the screen here the weapon profile again at 3 attacks, weapon skill 3+, strength 6, -2 AP, 2 damage. Now for the purpose of our assessment, we're going to calculate this on a per model basis. So all the numbers you see is the output or damage of one model. In order to get the amount for a squad of 5, you simply multiply that number by 5. This is going to make our comparison a lot easier when we pull in the gauntlets later on in the video, so we have a one-to-one comparison. We're also going to assume for the purpose of this math that the target you're hitting is going to have 2 judgment tokens on it, and otherwise it is bare bones, which means there are no stratagems or negative impacts or modifiers that are being added to this profile. It is just the numbers you see here on the screen. And so plugging these numbers together, what we see is that 3 attacks at weapon skill 3+, going down to a 2, results in 2.5 hits on average. When we weigh these number of hits against different toughness brackets, as I illustrated here on the screen, we get a certain number of successful wounds that are going through. And so we see against targets that are less than toughness 6, we have around 2.08 wounds that will go through. For T6, 1.67. Between toughness 7 and toughness 10, we'll have 1.25. And for anything T12 and above, we're looking at 0.83 on average. And again, this is for the axe strike profile. But what does this actually mean? Well, on the next slide here, we see that I took those numbers and basically transcribed them into a table weighed against different save characteristics according to the bracket of toughness that that unit is in. So for those of you unfamiliar with my other videos, this is the format I like to use. We essentially get a wide range table of all the theoretical profiles in the game, and you simply plug in a defensive stat line and you're able to assess, on average, how much damage will go through to that target using this profile. So again, we're going to keep this very surface level for now, and what I just want you to notice is that it looks like the highest numbers for this weapon profile can be found at the less than T6 and T6 level. And again, for those of you not familiar with the format that I use for these assessments, the numbers that are in black are the total amount of unsaved wounds that go through, and then the colored numbers underneath them correspond to the actual damage that's going through when we simply multiply the number of unsaved wounds by the damage profile of the weapon, in this case 2. So if you were to look at less than T6 and 2+, so the very first number at 1.04, that's the total amount of unsaved wounds that goes through, resulting in that amount times 2 for the weapon's damage profile, resulting in 2.08 raw damage. So I said the numbers here appear to be best when we're looking at something less than T6 and T6, going from a 2+ save to a 5+ save without invulnerables. More specifically, the optimal area for damage appears to be something that is less than T6 with a 4+ or 5+ base save and no invul. This is where we see the highest amount of damage that goes through for this weapon profile, and I highlighted that in green for you on the screen. We see a very similar pattern when we consider the invulnerable save profiles, again being ideal when we're looking at something less than T6 to toughness 6, where we get the highest amount of raw damage that's going through to our target. Being most optimal when something has a 5+ invulnerable or a 6+ invulnerable save. Again, this is all just very theoretical and just a very high surface level view of the damage. So let's plug in a real example and see what kind of numbers we get. Plugging in a squad of 5 Primaris Intercessors, we could align their save characteristic to be less than T6, so we know it's in the first row, and they all basically have a 3+ base save, so it takes us to the second column. And so what we see is that there's a total amount of unsaved wounds going through here, so basically failed saves your opponent makes, at 1.39 unsaved wounds. Now please remember that this is per model, which means if we want to look at a full squad of 5, each running the melee axe with a strike profile, we simply have to multiply this number by 5. And so what we see if we do multiply it by 5 is that this squad will reliably pick up 6.95 Primaris Intercessors while using the strike profile. Now this in itself doesn't really tell us anything comparative because we haven't looked at any of the other weapon options yet. So the first thing we're going to do is compare this to its sweep profile just to see what kind of value we get if we alternate between the two forms. So looking at the sweep profile at the top here, I put it once again just to have that as a helpful reference. We have 6 attacks at weapon skill 3, strength 4, -1 AP, and 1 damage. And the assumption here once again is that it's calculated per 1 model, and we're assuming that there are 2 tokens on our target. Plugging in the amount of hits, we see that 6 attacks at weapon skill 3 plus with a judgment token translates to around 5 hits on average. So already much higher than what we saw with the strike profile. Running those against different toughness brackets, we see we get on average 4.17 wounds against something less than toughness 4, 3.33 into something toughness 4, 2.5 when it's something that's toughness 5 to toughness 7, and 1.67 when it's toughness 8 or higher. Plugging these numbers onto our table and running them against saving throws, we see something that looks like this. Now immediately, it looks like the most optimal target for a sweep attack profile is going to be something that is either T4 or less and has a 4, 5, or 6 plus save without an invul. And this is where we get the most amount of damage that goes through. You'll also notice for this example that there are no numbers in black, and that's because this weapon's profile is actually just 1 damage, so whatever amount of unsaved wounds go through is simply that times 1, which is the number that it is. So no need to have 2 rows here and keep it confusing, we'll just put 1. So whatever you see here is both the amount of unsaved wounds that go through and the amount of damage that we inflict. Plugging in Cthonian shock troops as an example for this weapon profile as the target we're trying to put our attacks into, we see that they line up to be less than toughness 4, so in that first row again, and with a save of 5 plus base. So that puts us at the 5 plus base column. And what we see is that there's 3.47 unsaved wounds that will go through per model, resulting in 3.47 damage total on this attack. If we were to multiply this by 5, we see that we'll actually reliably kill around 17.35 guardsmen on average if we threw a squad of 5 berserks in using the sweep attack profile. So honestly, pretty good. But how do these 2 profiles compare to each other? Putting the strike and sweep profiles side by side, we actually see some pretty interesting results. So universally, it looks like damage is significantly higher for a strike profile across the board, looking at the colored numbers here. However, it's important to note that the total amount of unsaved wounds, being the number in black, is actually quite high for the sweep, more so than the strike. Now, why is this important? Well, what this tells us is that on average, we'll get more unsaved wounds that will go through against the target using the sweep profile than if we were to attack them with the strike. This is relevant because what happens if you're attacking something that only has 1 wound? It doesn't necessarily matter that you have 2 damage on your strike profile when the total amount of unsaved wounds is going to be significantly lower than that caused by the sweep. In other words, in those instances against 1 wound targets, for example, the sweep profile actually does more damage because we don't care that we're multiplying the total unsaved wounds by 2. We don't care that there's an extra point of damage on the strike. What we care about is doing the most amount of unsaved wounds because each model we're targeting has only 1. So whether it has 1 damage on the profile or 2 damage on the profile, we'll still kill 1 per unsaved wound. In those instances, the sweep actually outperforms the strike quite significantly because we have more value on those 1 wound attacks. Okay, so what if we don't care that the model has 1 wound? What if it has 2 wounds or more? I highlighted some numbers on the screen here representing realistic targets that this criteria would fall under. And so we see I put something at T12 with a 3 plus save, less than T6 with a 4 plus save, between toughness 6 and 11 with a 4 plus plus, and I put something at less than T6 with a 6 plus plus for the strike profile. And what we see when we compare the same profile to a sweep attack is that we actually get less damage that goes through using the sweep, as expected, for almost all of these instances, which are highlighted in red. However, there are some brackets of toughness and saves where the damage is about equivalent, and this is notably at a 4 plus plus invulnerable save for something at toughness 7, which is highlighted in yellow. We see a similar result at something that is less than toughness 4 for a 6 plus plus invulnerable save, where the total damage inflicted by both profiles will be equivalent at 3.47, also highlighted in yellow for you. In these instances, it doesn't matter that the sweep profile is only 1 damage because we still end up doing the same amount as the strike, which is at 2 damage. So let's look at a real life example here and plug in a realistic 2-wound model unit and see which weapon profile comes out on top. Looking at another squad of Primaris Intercessors and plugging that into both tables, we see that for the strikes, which are in red, we're looking at less than T6 with a 3+ base save, and for the sweep profile, we're at toughness 4 with a 3+ save. And so what we see here with the strike is that we're actually inflicting 1.39 unsaved wounds, which result in 2.78 damage per model that is attacking. Conversely, with the sweep, we see that we only get 1.67 unsaved wounds, and these are damage 1, which means the amount of damage that goes in is just 1.67. So do the extra unsaved wounds that go through matter against the target of this profile that sits at 2 wounds? Well, it turns out it doesn't. It actually falls significantly behind. What we see is that for a squad of 5 all equipped with axes, if you were to attack a squad of Primaris Intercessors using your strike mode, you actually end up inflicting 13.9 damage over the 6.95 unsaved wounds that would go through. And to get those numbers again, I simply multiplied both the unsaved wound characteristic of 1.39 by 5, and that results in the 6.95 unsaved wounds. Because I know that these guys are 2 wounds apiece, we just have to look at the 6.95 unsaved wounds, and what we see is that we pick up 6.95 Primaris Intercessors if we attack the squad using 5 axes on strike. Looking at the sweep profile instead, we actually see that the 1.67 for unsaved wounds only translates to 8.35 damage. And so in this case, while the 8.35 unsaved wounds is actually significantly higher than the 6.95 unsaved wounds that go through with the strike profile, this actually only results in 4.18 dead intercessors. Why is that? Because these are damage 1, which means we have to essentially divide this amount by 2 because it would take 2 attacks to kill 1 model. Through this example, we see that even if something is sitting on 2 wounds, and it's a pretty relatively easy target for the sweep profile to hit, being toughness 4, it's actually not enough of an impact having those extra attacks at the reduced strength and damage to be able to compare with the strike profile into a 2-wound target. So what about 3-wound models? I think we all know the answer to this, but just to take a quick look, if I were to plug in some Chaos Terminators who are sitting at T5 with a 2+ base save, 4+ invulnerable, what we see is that we get 1.04 unsaved wounds that go through with a strike profile, resulting in 2.08 damage per wound, and we also get 0.83 unsaved wounds or 0.83 damage when we use the sweep profile, which I highlighted in red. What this translates to in reality is actually 10.4 damage when we multiply it by 5 for the strike profile, resulting in 2 dead Terminators and 1-on-1 wound. Conversely, with the sweep, when we multiply that by 5, we only get 4.15 damage, which means we kill just 1 Terminator and leave 1-on-2 wounds. So even though some of the damage is lost using the strike profile of the axe because it's damage 2 and these guys have 3 wounds each, it doesn't actually make that much of a difference. In fact, we still come out significantly ahead over the sweep profile when we're targeting something of 3 wounds. So what does this all mean? Well, putting it together, it looks like the axe performs best, regardless of what profile you're using, when you put it into a target that is less than T6. This is the optimal area, the optimal range and bracket of where you should be directing these attacks. But if we looked at more specifically what profile to use for the axe, the striking provides us with way more raw damage output. However, the sweeping profile provides us with less damage, but more unsaved wounds, which is significantly more impactful when we're targeting things that have 1 wound only. However, as soon as we try using the strike profile into something that has 2 wounds or more, we typically get way more damage output using the strike profile compared to the sweep. So ultimately, the sweeping profile is really good for things that are 1 wound and less than or equal to toughness 6, but the strike profile in reality is going to just get you a lot more mileage into anything beyond that 1 wound level. So now we have a better idea of how we should be using the axe, but how does this actually compare to the other loadout choices we have available, being primarily the concussion maul? I plugged in the maul profile for you at the top just as a reminder. It's 3 attacks, weapon skill 4+, strength 9, -2 AP, and 3 damage. And again, the same assumption is that it's calculated on a per 1 model basis, and we're assuming that there are 2 judgment tokens on the target. Looking at the amount of successful hits, we see that we get, on average, 2 hits. with their respective successful wounds, illustrated below. Plugging this into the table, we get a nice spread of values that look like this. I highlighted in yellow some of the numbers that I feel best represent what types of targets will be directing these mauls into, considering that they're 3 damage apiece. And so I cut this off at the 4+ save, so anything between 2+ to 4+ save, and I omitted the invulnerable saves, as we'll look at that separately in just a second. So for these base values here, what we see is that we actually do some pretty decent damage overall. Even if we consider higher toughness targets, like things greater than the strength of this profile being higher than toughness 9, we actually still get some pretty reliable damage that goes through here per one guy. And consider that you have to multiply that by 5. So if we looked at something that was greater than toughness 9, 3+ save, we would actually get 10 damage that goes through instead of the 2 that you see here. So pretty good. Looking over at the invulnerable saves, it looks like the damage here does drop a little bit, as expected, but I think the sheer weight of access to damage 3 on these profiles helps to ensure that even when we get fewer unsaved wounds that go through, the raw damage is still pretty decent overall. Even considering something with a 4++, which is pretty intimidating, if we were to consider that the target we're hitting that's less than toughness 9 with a 4++ would get 2.5 damage taken per model, multiplying that by 5 would result in 12.5 damage inflicted by a squad of 5. So that on its own is interesting, but it doesn't really tell us much when we want to compare it to the axes. So let's put that side by side with the 2 profiles, and we'll see who comes out on top. And so putting those together gives us something that looks like this. I have the mauls highlighted in purple here, and the strike profile for the axe is highlighted in red. I'm only going to focus on the strike profile for the axe because I think it's pretty obvious here that we wouldn't want to waste the 3 damage profile of the mauls onto something that is 1 wound, and we already know that the strike does better into anything that is not 1 wound. So we'll compare the mauls and the strikes together because these are obviously the most compatible weapons. Just general overview, it looks like the damage for the mauls is significantly higher across the board, irrespective of toughness or saves that need to be made. However, the total amount of unsaved wounds is somewhat higher when we consider something below toughness 6 for the strike profile of the axe, and I highlighted that in green for you here. So in this instance here, the strike actually comes out on top in terms of unsaved wounds, meaning that if we were trying to kill something that's sitting at maybe 2 wounds, the strike might be a little bit better in this instance because we get more failed saves, despite being lower damage. Think about the Primaris Space Marines, for example, who would sit at less than T9 with a 3+ save. In those instances of 2 wounds, the strike axe still comes out on top because we only care about the 2 damage weapon characteristic and not the 3 damage that the maul provides us at the expense of having fewer unsaved wounds go through. But we see that the lead is quickly taken over by the mauls, especially when we enter that T6 area. So at the T6 bracket, this is where the 2 weapon profiles are actually equivalent in unsaved wounds that are happening, but because the mauls have 3 damage, they simply come out on top in terms of the actual damage characteristic that is under it. We could see a similar pattern for invulnerable save characteristics, where at the first row of less than T6, we actually still get more unsaved wounds going through with the strike weapon profile of the axe compared to the mauls, who are slightly less. Now, this next slide might look a little bit confusing, but all it's telling you is that at the 4++ level, so a 4-up invulnerable save, we still see the mauls continue to come out ahead at the toughness 6 level, only falling behind slightly when we look at something that is T10 exact. However, we know that theory isn't always reality, and on the table, anything that's toughness 10 is going to have more than 2 wounds, which means despite having worse unsaved wounds that go through for the mauls, we actually still get way more raw damage that goes in, which is more impactful. I want to show you 3 quick examples to help tie all this together. And so the first one is going to be with the Primaris Intercessors. So plugging those numbers in on our table, I highlighted the top one in red and the bottom one in green. You could look at this yourself if you want, but we're just looking at something that is T4 with a 3+ save, so it falls on this category here. And so what we see is that using the mauls, we actually inflict 16.65 damage. However, a lot of that damage is wasted because these are only 2 wounds apiece. And so what we actually get based off of our unsaved wounds that are going through times 5 is we only kill between 5 and 6 intercessors. Conversely, with the axe profile, we're getting less raw damage at 13.9 when we times that by 5, but we actually have 6 to 7 dead intercessors instead. So on average, we'll pick up an extra intercessor using the strike profile simply because we have more unsaved wounds that go through. So in this instance here, where something is 2 wounds or less, the impact is a little bit better with the strike simply because we have more unsaved wounds that are being forced on our opponent. And again, keep in mind, this is only for something that is less than toughness 6. Think about something like intercessors who are T4 2 wounds, or also with Necron Scarabs, which are T2 and have 4 wounds. In these instances, the higher unsaved wounds are weighed more favorably because each one maximizes the damage of the profile, regardless of them all being damage 3. Even with those Scarabs that are 4 wounds apiece, we will get more that go through with the strike profile of the axe because there are more unsaved wounds. But in every other instance, beyond being less than toughness 6 and less than 2 wounds, or 4 wounds if you consider the Scarabs, the mauls will simply outperform the axe. This is particularly egregious when we look at something like the Terminator squad, who are 3 wounds apiece. So what we see here is that we would actually inflict 12.5 damage with the mauls if we had 5 berserks running these weapons, killing 4 Terminators on average. But if we were running the axe with the strike mode, we'd only pick up 2 Terminators and leave 1 on 1 wound. What about something that's toughness 12? Something that's significantly higher than the strength characteristic of 9 for the maul weapon, and also, in this case, double the value we see for the strength characteristic of the axe weapon in strike mode in terms of the toughness value. So 6 going to 12 is double. Let's see what happens. In this instance, the amount of unsaved wounds going through across both profiles are actually relatively similar, but the mauls still come out ahead simply because you will get more successful wounds that go through since you're going to be wounding this on 5s going down to 4 versus the axe, which will be wounding on 6 going down to 5. And what we get for damage is that if you run 5 mauls and you swing into a knight, on average you'll do 10 damage to it, which is really good. However, with the axe in strike mode, you'll only be doing 5.55. Summarizing these two profiles together, what we see is that the mauls provide way more raw damage output universally across the table. However, the axes will kill slightly more models when we look at something less than toughness 6 at 2 wounds or at 4 wounds, simply because the profile is a little more favorable into something like this. It's easier to connect the wounds, and when they do connect, the amount of unsaved wounds you put through is higher, meaning you get very clean kills, utilizing all the damage of the profile. The axes are also better into low toughness single wound models if you want to utilize the sweep option of this profile instead. The mauls, however, have an easier time hurting high toughness targets, whereas the axes will struggle significantly. Ultimately, it's a little meta and matchup dependent, but the mauls provide, in my opinion, better overall play, since really a lot of people are running high toughness targets, and if you have a way of dealing with those effectively, you simply get way more value out of your unit. It's worth mentioning that, being damage 3, the mauls are actually one of the only ways we get access to damage 3 in the army, when we consider melee especially, so I think that in itself is a point that's worth considering. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of the video that you have some flexibility in loadouts, in that you get to choose between equipping a full squad with mauls or a full squad with axes, and of course getting the free grenade launcher, which has no impact on your melee output. However, you also have the option of having one single model in your unit take the gauntlets instead of either mauls or axes. So let's see if this is actually worth it, or is it better to simply just take 5 of something instead? Concussion gauntlets have a little bit of an interesting profile. I think what they were trying to go for design purposes was have something a little bit in between of both options. So you get 4 attacks here, weapon skill 4+, it's strength 9, -1 AP, 2 damage, and it's twin linked, so you reroll your wound rolls that failed. And plugging the numbers onto a table, we get a spread that looks like this in blue. First, let's compare it to the mauls. And just an overhead view, what we see just quickly scanning through the table is that it looks like we get more unsaved wounds across the board here using gauntlets when we compare it to the mauls. However, the damage output is actually a little bit lower into most of those targets when compared to the output of the mauls. For instance, if we look at things that don't have an invulnerable save, basically across the table here highlighted in red and in green, we see that the mauls come out on top in terms of damage output. When we look at invulnerable saves as a whole, this changes a little bit. We actually see the gauntlets edge out slightly ahead for damage done, interestingly. There is one notable bracket where the damage difference might be compelling enough to consider gauntlets, and that's at the greater than toughness 9 level. We can see in some cases between 0.5 and 0.7 extra damage for this one model in the unit, which could be attributed to the weapon's innate ability to reroll wound rolls. Looking at the gauntlets versus the axes instead, as we could probably expect, we do see the axe come out ahead for targets that are less than toughness 6 due to the unsaved wounds and total damage characteristics of this profile. However, at toughness 6 and beyond, much like in comparison to the mauls, the axes begin falling off. And this is because the weight of attacks simply does not compare to the extra strength of the weapon profile provided by the gauntlets, which is very similar to that of the mauls. So all in all, nothing too surprising here. When we look at invulnerable saves, the gauntlets simply come out on top at every instance, where the twin linked ability really helps in making your opponent take more saving throws, increasing the probability that one of those might go through. We covered a lot of information, but let's see how this all fits together. So in summary, it looks like the mauls are generally the highest damage output weapon across the board. It's better into high toughness targets. We get more raw damage that goes through because these targets, again, will usually have more than 2 wounds. And because of that, it's just simply the better choice when we're aiming to do damage to such units. The axes offer less damage in return for more unsaved wounds. As a result of that, they're better into things that are naturally at a lower wound count and, due to the weapon strength, at a lower toughness bracket as well. The axe also offers flexibility between sweeping and striking. However, it's worth noting that really the incentive for the axe is to take it because you want to have the sweep option. If you're taking the axe for the strike, you might as well just take the maul instead, because in 90% of the targets, you'll do more damage with a maul on. So if you want to take the axe, it really looks like the incentive here is for that ability to pick up more 1 wound or 2 wound models that are at lower toughness. For the gauntlets, I was surprised to see that they're actually pretty decent. There's a very marginal damage increase when we attack something that has an invulnerable save when we compare it to the mauls, but it's also weaker into sweep appropriate targets that the axe would be better utilized for instead. All in all, it's kind of in a really weird spot. And the reason for that is because you have to keep in mind that only one model gets access to the gauntlets. If it were the whole squad, I think there'd be a pretty compelling argument to take the gauntlets instead. But the problem is that you lose some damage into targets that the other weapons will naturally do better into. And you do better into targets that the rest of the squad is going to do worse into. So it sort of just doesn't really fit into what you're trying to accomplish with the unit. It's incongruous. From my own personal experience and from what I've seen in competitive lists on the channel, I just feel like a lot of people don't really bother with it. You got to keep in mind it's just on one model, right? So, you're getting an extra 0.3 damage that might go through, but it's not multiplied by 5. It's just literally 0.3 to 0.5 damage. I don't think many people bother including it, and as a whole, people often just forego this weapon entirely. Ultimately, the choice between running axes and mauls is one that I think is a little more meta-dependent than some of the other options we've seen in our other videos, but I do think overall, you get better value out of the mauls. This is a 100-point unit, it's pretty cheap, and because you're able to actually swing very effectively and punch up into things that usually you'd probably expect to not be able to touch, you wind up with a very threatening trading unit that's only 100 points and has the ability to dish out a ton of damage for its cost. But that said, there's definitely a place for axes. We've all seen it run in lists before, but I think it's really only if you anticipate needing to use the sweep option to take care of low wound count, low toughness, high model count targets. Okay, that was a lot of math, but I promise it's done now. The rest of the video, we're going to take some time to touch upon whatever's remaining on our agenda, starting off with how to best use this unit. Now, the Berserks are a very cheap unit coming in at 100 points, and we saw on the tables that they actually have the capacity to do a really high amount of damage, but they have low survivability as we saw on their data card. So what does this mean? it means that they are a very solid trading piece because of this, and primarily because they could punch up, and punch up quite well. The drawbacks for this unit are that they're very slow, and they're also quite vulnerable. So how do you get the most use out of them? Well, the answer is staging. Staging is key. But Matt, how do you stage when you're only movement 5, you ask? Well, there are 3 main ways, and we'll take some time to look at each one in a little more detail. The first one is transporting them via Sagittar. The second one is transporting them via Hecaton Land Fortress. And the third one, which is my least preferred option, but totally a valid method, is simply keeping them hidden near your deployment zone objective. Let's start off with transporting them via Sagittar. There are a few very good benefits to using the Sagittar this way, and the Berserks by extension. The first one is by taking advantage of the Transport Scout ability. The Scout ability is quite powerful and very potent because it allows you to get some extra free movement at the start of the game, which means you can get yourself into a really good position. If you go second, you reposition yourself to be a little more defensive, and if you go first, maybe you push these out a little more aggressively to try to get some early ground. It's basically just 6 inches of free movement that you get at the beginning of the game. Now, what's also nice is that the Sagittar is very fast. It moves 12, so you get your free 6-inch movement, and then you take your real move, which is 12 inches, and then you get somewhere behind a ruin. And I put a little example here for a graphic, and this is using Hammer and Anvil deployment on GW Leviathan Layout 1. And so you see in this case, we start on the left-hand side of the table, behind some cover, or right at the side. We get that 6-inch scout, we move 12, and then we drop our cargo out, right behind the ruin where they're nice and safe for the turn. This is a stage. This is good because if your opponent comes out and they try to threaten the center or they get too close, well, now it's a very easy charge for you to make. And more importantly, it's very safe for you to do so because you could probably get a charge off behind the ruin, behind the wall, meaning that you won't get overwatched or die immediately, which is really good for something like this that is otherwise quite slow and vulnerable. The other option, which doesn't really ever come up, but in theory, you would be able to take your scout move, which doesn't count as actually moving, meaning that the next turn you could disembark and charge if you wanted to. I don't think this comes up too often, and it's not as powerful as the first option I discussed, but it's still quite nice to know that you could potentially just disembark and charge at the very beginning of your turn if something was close to you. Maybe they infiltrated a unit nearby, and you have that opportunity to get out and charge right away. Other than being just a very fast-moving unit, which allows you to get to where you need to be very quickly, it also adds durability and protection to your unit because they first have to kill the Sagittar. And if they do kill the Sagittar and you get mortal wounds because maybe you rolled some ones when they get out, you have your feel no pain to maybe try and brush off something, and at worst case your 2 wounds, so you'll still likely be alive. You also have the option of using the Sagittar as a basis for a countercharge stage. So you stay in the Sagittar as much as you'd like, and then when something that is scary is close to you, that's when you disembark and you charge it. Or if something charges you, you get out and charge it back. The second option is transported via Hecaton Land Fortress. I wasn't a big fan of this until we discussed the video in one of my competitive list analyses, and the pilot used this method and went into comments to explain a little bit more as to how it worked. And I actually thought it was quite nice. I got to try it out in one of my games recently, and while I don't have 2 Berserks to use it effectively, like we'll discuss in a second, I still used it with 1 squad, and I quite liked the outcome. One of the reasons you would want to use this in a Hecaton Land Fortress as opposed to a Sagittar is that at the expense of the scout move, you gain extra transport capacity and you're significantly more durable. What's also quite nice is that typically the Land Fort wants to go where the Berserks want to go. So both of these are going to be trying to get to the same place, probably the middle of the table. I mentioned the transport capacity, and that's a big one. So in this instance, you have some flexibility. You could actually take 1 squad with axes and 1 squad with mauls, put them in the Hecaton, move it up to the middle, park it there to stage, and when you need to charge, depending on what unit your opponent throws at you, you could use the sweep profile for the axes, or you disembark and charge with the mauls to get in the face of something of a higher toughness bracket. In this example, I used the search and destroy deployment, where there's that bubble in the middle, and you can see turn 1, we simply move our Hecaton towards the middle, we sit there, and we wait. You could go behind a ruin, you could go in the middle, and as things come to you, you disembark the appropriate unit that's inside, and you get it to charge and fight and kill whatever's coming your way. The last example I put here is simply keeping your berserks back on your deployment zone objective, or near it anyway. So for this example, I use sweeping engagement deployment, which is essentially the diagonal line deployment style. In this case, we would simply keep our berserks secure and hidden inside of a ruin or behind it, and if anything comes down or anything comes close to our deployment zone, we could use these to safely push out and charge from behind ruins where they can't be shot. This is probably my least preferred method of using the berserks because, like I said, they tend to punch really hard, and if you get them in the right spot, namely the middle, you have access to more targets, generally speaking. So I do think this is a valid use of them, but you'll probably end up getting more value if you do bring them somewhere closer to the center, properly staged. I put in parentheses low mental load, and that's basically what I mean by that. It's that you sit them back and you don't really think about them unless something comes close to you. In terms of stratagems and combos, we really namely have one that I think would be the primary use for the berserks, and I think it's excellent for them, but this is Warrior's Pride. And Warrior's Pride essentially allows you to add extra AP to your attacks so long as that target has judgment tokens on them, and is proportionate to the amount of judgment tokens they have. So if they have 1, you get an extra AP. If they have 2, you get 2 extra AP. This could be extremely powerful if you consider the damage 3 profile of the berserks themselves. So ideally, you would use this on a target that will not penalize your AP through an invulnerable save. This ensures you get the most amount of value out of your stratagem, and it helps you get extra damage through, which is always nice. I want to give a special acknowledgement to Appraising Glare here, which will allow you to have a very interesting combo potentially. It synergizes quite nice because you can essentially pick a spot on the board through the objective marker, and anything that's on it counts as having 1 additional judgment token. This means you could charge in your berserks and pop Warrior's Pride on them, at minimum for 1 extra AP. This could be exceptionally potent if you're fighting something, for example, that has a 2-up base save and a 5+ invulnerable. So now your 2 AP weapon profile is actually going to go up to 3 AP, and you get the full value out of that weapon without impacting it through the invulnerable save of your target. It's worth mentioning there's one other stratagem that I think could see some use on a Berserk squad. I've never used this stratagem ever because I think there's just way better things that you could be using your CP on, but this is something that might potentially come up, and it's Newfound Nemesis. So as an honorable mention, Newfound Nemesis essentially allows you in your opponent's shooting or charge phase after your opponent resolved their attacks and your unit was reduced to below half strength, and you simply give that unit a judgment token. You'll always be a little limited because you can never have a character accompany these guys, which means you'll never have a warlord with the unit. So natively, you already lose out on some value with the stratagem because it could go up to 2 potentially, but you'll only always get 1. And it's not necessarily horrible. I just think it's very niche and there's probably better things that you can use your CP on. But if you do want to use it, what it allows you to do is essentially take the hit, survive it, put a judgment token, and now suddenly you could punch much harder. First of all, because if they were at 0 or 1, they suddenly get the judgment token, which natively adds some value to your damage characteristic, but it allows you to synergize it with the stratagem we previously mentioned, Warrior's Pride, where now you have access to gaining the extra AP. You also, of course, get some slightly extra utility for the rest of your army, but at the end of the day, I think if the Berserks get in combat with something, they're probably just going to die when your opponent gets to fight them, so you probably won't ever use this. I want to wrap the video up with some very quick considerations for when you do decide to run this unit in your list. Please keep in mind, it is a glass cannon. You should never worry about the survival of this unit. You should just worry about getting it into combat with the target you're trying to kill, because it will probably kill it. They are extremely effective at punching up, and because of that, it makes for an excellent trading piece at only 100 points. The drawbacks of this unit being their vulnerability and their very slow movement means they're quite difficult to master, but they're a very good unit nonetheless. And if you are careful with your positioning and you allow yourself to stage properly and put them into an appropriate target, You will always get value out of this unit, I promise you. Don't forget, they also have access to taking the mole launcher, and the mole launcher never works for me because it happens on a 4+, but sometimes it does. And so keep that in mind because it has access to a couple very interesting keywords, being indirect, which means you can shoot it from basically anywhere on the board, as long as you're within range, and it has blast, weirdly, so it's dual purpose a little bit. The damage isn't great, but you will be able to get some value if it does go off by putting it on something in your opponent's side of the table that's maybe very threatening and trying to get towards you, like a Cthonian shard that moves at, I think, movement speed 5. One last consideration, which is maybe more of just a tip. If you're starting off and you're not really sure how to effectively trade units, something really helpful is just simply asking yourself, will this help me? And more importantly, how many points is that? That being your opponent's unit that you're trying to kill. You can even ask your opponent, hey, how many points is this? And if it's more than the Berserks, at the simplest level, it's a good trade. There are way more considerations, of course, like primary and secondary, but if you're just starting off, maybe just keep that in mind, is that you're really just trying to kill more than 100 points with this thing because it can. All in all, it's a very solid unit that's very cheap and very fragile, but man, this thing can do damage when you get it into the appropriate targets, making for a very recent staple in almost every competitive list. Alright guys, that was a long video, hopefully a little bit shorter than the other ones. I tried to speed through it and skip over some of the math, so let me know if you found this format a little bit better, or if you prefer I slow things down a bit. What do you guys think about the Berserks? Have you tried running axes? Do you prefer the mauls? What about the gauntlets? Let me know in the comments down below. As always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll catch you all in the next one.